Great, so it's 1:30, so I think we will get started here. So my name's Deborah Harford. I'm the Executive Director of ACT, the Adaptation to Climate Change team at SFU. And this afternoon's session is called Framing the Nature of Assets. We're looking at natural asset management as a climate action strategy and as a subset of asset management writ large. So just a quick introduction here to our agenda. I'm just going to speak very briefly a little bit about ACT's work on natural assets and nature-based solutions. And then we've got 5 fantastic panelists for you. Dustin Carey from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Mel Reasoner from Climatic Resources Consulting, Ian Gerritsen from ICI Infrastructure, Machado from the town of Gibsons, and Hilary Elliott from the village of Silverton. And each of them is going to give a short presentation, which will give you some great insights into the different levels of work that's going on asset management and natural asset management, from the federal level through to consulting and at the local government level. And then we're going to send you into breakout rooms, or rather we're not going to send you, you're going to pick which of our panelists you'd like to have an in-depth discussion with. And so we'll have Dustin, Mel, Ian, and then Manny and Hilary together as a local government breakout. And you'll have 15 minutes with them to learn more and ask them questions and have a discussion. And then we'll bring you back and each panelist will give a high-level report back, just a couple of points from your discussion. And then we'll have an opportunity for a whole group discussion. So if you weren't in a breakout room with one of our fantastic panelists, then you'll still have an opportunity to ask them a question or make a comment in that last little piece. And then at the very end, we just got a 5-minute teaser and introduction to our 2 sessions tomorrow, and a quick poll we're going to invite you to participate in at the very end. So ACT is excited to be co-hosting this conference, and I would like to just quickly acknowledge that where I am sitting right now and where I'm working from is the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam and Squamish peoples, and we're very grateful to have the privilege and opportunity to work on these lands. And so one of our main focus at ACT right now, and has been since 2016, is how to ensure that our adaptation actions are integrated with emissions reduction and looking at ways we can achieve further co-benefits through that integration. And so we call that low carbon resilience. And we really see this as a step change in climate action because of the growing pressure to reduce our emissions, which is really going up very fast here, every year. The fact that we are seeing tangible climate change impacts that are being measured now in terms of the level that climate is influencing major wildfires, storms, floods, and other events. And we've got very good data showing us the influence of these things in the future. And we also are seeing a really big uptick in the need for addressing equity and social justice. We have a huge biodiversity crisis, and we have human health, obviously very much front of mind with the pandemic. And so we're asking, how do we ensure that our actions really systemically benefit these key crucial priorities that are only going to get more intense as time goes by? And so we have a project called ICABCCI, which is an unfortunate acronym for the Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities Initiative, which is co-creating this approach with local governments. And Manny and Hilary, our 2 local government champions with us today, are 2 of our partner communities. And so as a subset of low carbon resilience, or a very important strategy that's emerging around the world as being recognized because of all the benefits that it provides, is the use of nature-based solutions. And that's being characterized in lots of different ways. People are calling it natural assets when we're looking at the value the presence of ecosystems is providing for our local governments, for instance, in terms of reduced flood costs, for instance. But we're also looking at things like green infrastructure, which is green roofs or rain gardens. And we're looking at how do we connect up large scale implementations of these nature-based solutions, because ecosystems thrive better when they're connected, and species need to be able to move as they are also trying to adapt to climate change. And so what we're seeing increasingly is that natural assets have benefits for adaptation and emissions reduction, equity, health, quality of life. They help biodiversity, they save money, they alleviate pressure on our aging infrastructure. And we're seeing really a lot of emergence of valuation and best practices around this. And we have a report on our website that the cover is there that delves into a lot of this stuff, including communities across Canada. And of course, the presence of ecosystems has cultural and spiritual values that you really cannot value in a financial sense. And so we really need to think carefully about how we include those priorities in our conversations as well. So I'm going to hand over now to our first presenter, Dustin Carey from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Dustin's a capacity building officer with the Municipalities for Climate Innovation program, and looking forward to hearing from you today, Dustin.
Thank you, Deb. So let's get this to advance. So yeah, it should come as no real surprise to anyone in attendance, but local governments in particular, the focus of FCM, are experiencing a number of competing pressures here. Within the latest Canada climate plan, the federal government has noted more ambitious climate emission reduction targets, and as identified in the Pan-Canadian Framework for Climate Change and the Economy, local governments are a key driver in implementing national solutions. So with indirect influence over about 50% of the emissions profile of Canada, there's no way to hit that, to hit those targets without the involvement of local governments. At the same time, we're seeing climate change really accelerating around the world. Sea level rise is advancing at about triple the rate it was only 2 decades ago. We're seeing the almost every year now, we're seeing the new warmest year on record, and manifestations of that are really occurring across Canada. While by no means a perfect proxy, you can see the upward trend in insured losses associated with catastrophic impacts from the insurance industry. And as a general rule of thumb, that captures about 1/4 of the societal losses coming only from impacts that cost, I think, $10 million as a minimum threshold. So in terms of overall climate loading on societies and the economy, that's only a piece of the pie. At the same time, as we've seen that increase in climate impacts and pressures, we've seen asset trends where over the past 60 years or so, local governments have become the largest owners of core public infrastructure in Canada. And while we had this huge boom in construction following the post-war period, we didn't really take the time to think through the life cycle budgeting of that. And over the 70s through 2000s, really, there was a general trend in deterioration of that asset. There has since been a degree of renewal in that level of spending and more strategic spending associated, but we're still sitting with more than $100 billion of local infrastructure sitting in either poor or very poor condition, which exacerbates the potential of failure for climate risk, but also offers an opportunity for improvement associated with designing for the future as we get into replacement. And of course, this past year has just thrown more wrenches at municipal finances. And I know that was kind of a depressing intro to this topic, but it really does just make the case that with fairly scant local resources, you really need to hit multiple benefits associated with each dollar. No offense to birds, I do love them, but I can't think of a better metaphor. FCM's been involved in this space for a while, and we really do see efficient use of asset management practices as the best way to meet these goals in a really resource efficient and strategic manner. Working with 11 communities that have gone through funded capacity building programs to bring in sustainability and climate resilience implications into asset management. Over 2019 and early 2020, we developed and launched the Guide for Integrating Climate Considerations into Asset Management, and brought that very much on a national roadshow, and it captured enough attention that was approached to bring in some of those resources for international learning as well. So this was a major influence on a climate resilient asset management chapter in a new UN manual as well that was launched last month. And within both of these the logical step forward processes that were involved, they do really put an emphasis on optimizing those strategies to hit the most benefits with the most affordable prioritization options available, making sure that fits within the overall fabric of your community and the like. And within both, we really do point to natural assets and low carbon solutions as some of those optimal approaches. The literature within this has really advanced within the past couple of years, to the point that neglecting to bring in that encouragement for local governments, both domestically and internationally, would almost be negligent on our part. And as a way that we do point to as a bit of a driving force behind that, MSIP has been involved in advancing natural asset and green infrastructure projects across the country as well. Using one example, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, they did such a good job with Manny and the other members of the first cohort that when they came to us for a $250,000 grant to advance this into another 6 communities, there was no real grounds for turning them down, and they've been a really standout example as part of our climate adaptation partner grants program. And as through this one, as just one example of that way to really reduce climate risk while providing some of those co-benefits, and including the avoided emissions associated with more carbon intensive construction, for instance, you can see that the contribution of natural asset improvement offers nearly $1 million in annual benefits to the city of Courtenay under a climate intensification scenario, compared to replacing those with engineered assets strictly from a flood perspective. So bring in some of those other ecosystem services that are at the moment more difficult to model, and that case for natural asset investment just becomes better. And I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about the benefits of the Natural Assets Initiative programming later on, but that's all I have under this bit of a lightning round introduction, and looking forward to these other presentations.
Great, thank you so much, Dustin. That's fantastic. Yes, and we have, obviously, Manny is the chair of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, so we may hear more from him on that. So next we're going to be hearing from Mel Reisner, Climatic Resources Consulting. So Mel, if you'd like to share your slides.
Okie dokie. I'll see if I can get the technology to work here. Okay. All right. So going from the big picture, well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk today. This is great to be involved in this session on asset management. And going from the big picture down to the very granular picture, I want to talk about some work that we've been doing with the city of Edmonton, and the example I'll show is from a small ski area in British Columbia. And we're using some software and an approach we've developed called localized climate analysis and projection. And oh, what happened here? Did I just pop out of here? Here we go.
Yeah, so you were.
Okay, I'm back in, sorry.
There we go, yeah.
Here we go. Okay. There we go. So I've been involved with the Columbia Basin Trust in providing climate information for communities for over a decade now, and we provided summaries of past climate change. So basically putting together climate history, and we provided climate projections. In this case, this is a low carbon future. And in Nelson, we're getting plus 2.6 degrees Celsius by the 2050s. And we sort of put these two together to give people an idea of the magnitude of the change. And when you look at that 2.6 degrees, which doesn't seem like a lot, and you compare that to the 20th century climate, which is the bell curve that you see, then the mean of the new bell curve is in almost all circumstances close to or off the tail of the historic bell curve. And the take-home message has been your average year in the 2050s will be beyond the hottest years experienced in the 20th century. So what people get from that is, okay, 2.6 degrees is big, it means a lot. And in most sessions, what we get to when we're looking at impacts and vulnerabilities, we end up with this risk matrix. And in most of the sessions, people are guessing at the likelihood. You know, is it very likely? Is it plausible? And what we tried to do with LCAP is to try to quantify this. And so the example that I'll show you quickly now is basically a small ski area in a Nordic ski area in British Columbia. And here's mean winter temperature projections and mean winter temperature history in red. And both are going up significantly. 2.7 degrees, low carbon pathway, 3.5 high carbon pathway. And so what the first step was to do was to look for correlations between climate indices and actual ski conditions. And one that popped out at us that worked pretty good was that when we were looking at January, February, March, mean daily maximum temperature versus the number of days after January 1st with more than 5 centimeters of snow on the ground, there's a fairly strong correlation here. And 5 centimeters of snow on the ground is pretty much a deal breaker for cross-country skiing. So, and what we found is that in general, the plus 4 degrees Celsius mean daily temperature in those months usually is associated with years when there's less than 5 centimeters of snow by mid-February. So in other words, a short, very bad season. The other piece of information that we used to identify thresholds was groomer logs and Facebook posts. And basically, you can see the 4-degree threshold there. Those red dots are years where the seasons were bad. There were comments that the skiing conditions were poor and the season ended early. And those 6 green dots were banner years. They had great snow conditions, and those were associated with minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this ski area was faced with deciding where to invest the resources for future operations. This is all happening at the low elevation site, and they also have a higher elevation site, which is cooler. And the question they're facing is, does it make sense to continue to invest resources and allocate resources to the low elevation site, or do we move to the high elevation site? So what LCAP software does is it takes the model projections of the index that we've defined and have thresholds for, and converts those into probabilities. So on the left, we're seeing January, February, March, mean daily temperature, model projections. The red is the historic, and there's our threshold that we've defined here. And over in the historic period, there's been 3 years, over 50 years, where we've exceeded 4 degrees Celsius. But looking forward into the future, by looking at the probability of these events occurring in the future, you can see that the chances are that by 2050, that becomes a 1 in 4 event, or in each year there's a 1 in 24 chance of having a winter where those mean daily temperatures were above 4 degrees Celsius. And this has been associated with bad ski conditions. So the take-home message here is by 2050, there's a 1 in 4 chance that your seasons are going to be pretty poor. By 2067, it's 40%. By 2077, it's 50%. So that's looking at it from the perspective of the bad years. Now looking at the perspective of the good years, in the last 12 years, 6 of the years have been banner years. They've had great snow conditions. And you know, the general feeling is, well, things are going good. Why should we change? Let's continue to invest in the low elevation site. But what we can do is look at the probability of years where your January, February, March Tmax average is below minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. And here's what that probability looks like. Although there's been 6 of 12 good years, by 2030, we're looking at 12% of the years will have good conditions. By 2050, it's down to 6.8%. And then by 2070, the probability drops down to 2%. Now, I'm not sure what the ski club has done with this information. I suspect based on this analysis, they've looked at it and said, well, it probably doesn't make sense to be investing resources in the low elevation site anymore. What we should probably do is move to the high elevation site and invest our resources there. My hunch is that's what they've done, but I'm not sure. So to summarize this, the approach involved, first of all, compiling local climate history and downscaled model projections and localizing the projections to especially in BC, the valley bottom conditions or the elevation that you're at. So the climate projections are very much localized to exactly where the operations are happening. You establish a link between the climate index or the indices and the ski conditions. You identify thresholds associated with unfavorable and favorable ski conditions. We determine the likelihood of exceeding these thresholds in future planning timeframes. And this informed the decision-making process regarding the allocation of resources in the future. Now, this approach just dealt with ski conditions at a Nordic ski club, but our feeling is that this could become a tool in the toolkit for essentially any asset that has a temperature threshold. And it can be direct, like bridges breaking at a specific temperature, or it might be indirect, like a situation where you have a budget associated with cooling degree days, or well, the intermediary piece is megawatt hours. So there's a relationship between megawatt hours spent on cooling buildings, the number of cooling degree days, and then there's also a budgetary threshold that you could translate into cooling degree days and look when you're going to exceed your budgetary thresholds. So I think that's all I want to talk about. Now we'll work through an example using the software live in the breakout group. But what we're hoping is that this approach can become something that is used in a granular way for specific assets in planning.
Thank you, Mel. That was great. Yeah, I think we talk a lot in adaptation about how do we make decisions in the context of uncertainty, and I think that's a really useful tool for helping people think through a number of different ramifications for their assets, be they natural or built. Great. Okay, so I'm going to now invite Ian Gerritsen, Senior Consultant with ICI Infrastructure. Ian, to share your slides and talking about asset management in Summerland.
Hi, everybody. Slides are up okay? All right. So I'm going to be speaking maybe in a bit more specificity, I guess, on what we were doing at the District of Summerland and how we helped integrate some of these LCR natural assets considerations in infrastructure decision making. So what we were asked to do was really formalize a capital investment planning process for the district. That was leading out of an asset management policy development and road mapping process. So that was kind of like the next step in the whole asset management journey for the district. So specifically, we were looking at developing a process for options identification and analysis, project planning, project prioritization, and scheduling. And that really involved just documenting and standardizing a lot of what they were already doing informally, as well as more explicitly aligning those processes with organizational strategic priorities, AM principles and practices. This is where you would also tie in, again, LCR considerations, natural assets, or say a risk-based model. If you've got a corporate risk framework, all of these things would feed in and tie in into a process like this. So what we started with was really a current state assessment of where things were at on a process level for the district, and then sort of a future state visioning process where they wanted to go. What we started working on in terms of sort of specific methods or processes was a business case process, so templates and a stage gating process for them. And then a prioritization framework where we worked with the senior leadership to decide on some common decision criteria, and then a process for assessing against that criteria. So that was built into the business case templates and the stage gate process, and then ultimately outputted into their existing budget process for a sort of approval at the council level. So really the work there is tying in some of these considerations with existing processes and fitting them in with something that is familiar with the organization. So a few learnings out of that whole process. Easy to use tools is a huge thing. A lot of the time, it's not just funding, but there's a lack of time and resources for actually making decisions and thinking through things. So the easier something is to use, the quicker someone can pick it up and make use of it. That also leads to actually having something that someone's going to continue to use after you've gone as a consultant. The worst thing for us is when we write a report, produce one of these processes, and then it just gets shelved and never gets used. So, you know, there's a certain amount of overcoming knowledge and skills and overcoming sort of status quo inertia that has to go along with this. And the easier the tools are to use, the more likely that is to happen. Very similar for using simple, clear language. Again, same types of considerations. The other thing to consider is there's a very broad range of people who are going to either input into that tool, use the tool directly, or make use of it from either a review or a sort of larger scale decision-making process. So they will have a very diverse range of experience, you know, technical and environmental knowledge and skills, asset management knowledge and skills. So you have to have a consideration for sort of the broader group of stakeholders that's involved. Intervene early and at the operational level. So particularly for considerations like LCR, natural assets, or anything that sort of isn't the status quo or the standard way that has been done in the past, the earlier that you can intervene in the process and the closer from an operational perspective that you are to whatever that issue of concern is, the more likely you are to be able to overcome some of that status quo inertia, some of the sort of rubber stamping or pre-selection of alternatives or options, and the sort of narrowly focused view of what a solution might be. That also leads to then a broader potential solutions pool where you're more likely to find some kind of holistic solution or a solution that integrates some of these other considerations and has multiple co-benefits from the perspective of not just in a general sense, but actually co-benefits in terms of different things you're achieving within the organizational context as well. Use real world examples. So, you know, case studies, other things that are sort of, you can show that someone has actually successfully done something, and particularly they've done something within a certain budget or a certain timeline, can be very healthy, both just in terms of giving people a bit of an idea of what to do, but also overcoming some of that that risk aversion and other organizational barriers that you might have to sort of new or untried solutions, or at least untried within a certain organization. Change management, that is a critical thing, and it's something that you don't want to avoid. So communicate early and often, focus on benefits and value, and lead the change. But also make sure that whoever is making decisions or executing has the right knowledge and skills. That's all important. And then the last bit there, just start doing it. Don't wait for training or some specific risk assessment or for a new position. Get going with something, improve over time, and there's the only way you're going to learn is to do it and then make it better. So keep going. I've got lots of other things that I can speak to, but I might leave it there for now, and yeah, let someone else speak.
Great, thanks, Ian. Yes, and I think in the breakout, be an opportunity for people to hear a bit more about what happened on the ground in Summerland and maybe what the real world process looked like. I'm sure they'll be very interested in how that played out in a community that's really has really achieved some amazing results in this whole area, and some really progressive pieces, including embedding low carbon resilience priorities into their business prioritization processes and that kind of thing. Thanks very much. And so now I'm going to hand over to Emanual Machado, CAO and Chief Resiliency Officer of the town of Gibsons, and also chair of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, to talk about integrating natural assets into asset management. Welcome, Manny. Manny, I think you're on mute. There you are.
Yes, there was some of my best work you guys couldn't hear at all, so unfortunately.
It's traditional. We have to have somebody who talks on mute. It's Zoom, after all.
Let me start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today in the traditional territory of the Shuswap Nation, and in the town of Gibsons is part of the Squamish Nation as well. So for us, it really all started with, stating the obvious and an important question, which was, how dependent are we on nature to continue to provide all of these services to our residents in our businesses? The answer might not surprise you, but we thought we had, some degree of dependence, but in our view, I think we're totally dependent on it. And I'd like to highlight that as sort of our first major risk questions that we had to contend with, because what we realized back in around 2012 is what we are calling infrastructure. It's really a blend of engineered and natural assets. They are interconnected and interdependent to function adequately. An engineered asset, like a water system, it doesn't operate on its own without being connected to nature on both ends, actually. So that's an important piece. And so with that, we asked council to declare, our asset management policy be expanded to more explicitly recognize the role these natural assets have. And we do recognize both fully natural and biomimicry types, such as bioswales that we construct and green roofs. We change our approach in terms of our teams. We created, basically get away from having a single department manage a single asset, because we noted that nearly all departments contribute to all of these types of classes. So we operate in teams, and adjusted our budget as well to better reflect that. I think the biggest transformation to note is that we moved away from managing individual assets into managing natural assets, and most importantly, natural systems at a watershed scale. This is another component of it, is our infrastructure doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that a cubic meter of water that falls in the Gibsons watershed travels through about 10 different agencies with all different approaches. So we're trying to get away from that. In the policy, we define a natural asset as a feature in the natural environment that provides a municipal-like service. But it's important also that as we work to assess and restore these natural areas, that we improve it to its highest ecological integrity that we can, but in our actions not inadvertently degrade from the restoration that was done. It's about finding the right balance. I also want to highlight that we have created a new position. It's a natural asset management technician. It's equivalent to an engineering tech, but for natural areas. And it's been a very good fit to help us manage this incorporation and this change management as well. Natural asset valuations, it's not about putting a price specifically on anything, but it is about, but it is part of our approach, and we could use it in the context of risk management. You could change it in the context of financial reporting, as we've done. We have explicit notes on our financial statements that speak to that dependency and the role of these actions. In operations and maintenance as well, you could use valuations there to determine, an operational cost for maintaining, let's say, a creek bed, for example, or something along those lines. For us, we had our first opportunity to do evaluation at White Tower Park, and this is the one that I wanted to talk to you about today. While we were planning, so that little photo there is White Tower Park. We've got about 3 of these ponds, and we're constructing another larger one this summer. But while we were planning, we're projecting with our growth to require a brand new stormwater system from Upper Gibsons to Lower Gibsons for about $4.5 million, as we were expecting. It turned out that we were in a position to do evaluation and a condition assessment, and noted that we could have expended this same area for about 25 cents on the dollar. So we did that, took that business case to council, which was harder for them to turn down $4.5 million versus $955,000, which is ultimately the cost expected to be paid. The capital projects, the capital costs are lower, as I said, but they're also the operational costs are very, very low by comparison. And we can get a lot more service into the future without having to expend the ponds. So it covers those extreme events, which we seem to get more and more of it as well. And I want to acknowledge both the funders, but also the engineering community that has been working with us to have the confidence to stamp and recognize the incredible role that these assets have. For obvious reasons, as I said, so council did support that option, and that led to further changes in our financial plan. We were able to go to the development community and say, because these asset costs less, we can reduce your drainage DCCs by 74%, which was well received. But we are now collecting a fee to restore a natural area, which we've never done before. We changed the subdivision and development standards as well, change our parks maintenance plans and standards. Our stormwater management plan is radically different than one we had. And we've now completing evaluations on our coastal areas and the remaining portions of the watershed. Our goal ultimately is to have infrastructure, our average asset, to be the most natural, the most reliable, the most energy efficient, and that it costs our taxpayers the least to operate over the long term. It's nearly impossible to have that goal without incorporating and managing your natural assets. So I leave it there, and I look forward to our discussion as well. I see I'm just coming up on my time, and I'm looking forward to follow-up sessions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Manny. Yes, that financial incentive is a really big one, and it's really exciting to see the work that is going on with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, creating practice guidelines for engineers to help them be able to support these kinds of projects more actively, which they're such an important profession in this context. Wonderful. So I'll hand over to Hilary. For your slides now.
Okay, great, thanks. And you can hear me fine?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this presentation or conference. And I would just like to start by saying that I recognize and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional territory I am working from and on which So stating that, I will then go into the fact that I loved hearing all the presentations beforehand. It was great because Dustin talked about two different case instances where FCM has helped out our small village with funding with ICABCCI, and also with us getting our basis of our asset management with other partner communities and a consultant, and we're working together. So we're able to create our QGIS software together. So that was great that FCM helped us out there. And then Mel also talked to some of the state of the basin information for the climate that the village of Silverton has utilized as part of what we think about in terms of planning for the future and what our climate might look like in terms of changes. We have our potable water comes from an aquifer, and a lot of information is not known about that aquifer, and the watershed is outside of our boundaries, and therefore any information that we can get from any experts that have the real data is very helpful for us in terms of climate adaptation mitigation and natural asset management. So that's really great. And of course, Ian and Manny are leaders in the natural asset management. So it's great that us small communities can look to what has been done and then learn from that and build on that for ourselves. So as I've sort of stated, we're very small, 195 people, small staff. There's 4 of us, plus our CFO is the City of Nelson. And everything we do is really has to be from a collaborative perspective. So whether that's data collection, LiDAR information, what have you, in order to be able to identify our natural assets, and then how are they a part of our community, and then what is it that we need to do in the future to ensure that they are not only there for future generations, but what is it that that we may need to do in order to ensure that. So each one might have its own different nuances. And then once you start, so when I first started thinking about natural asset management, it was because of our aquifer and our water management. And so our community, one of the most important things to them is the fact that we don't chlorinate our water because we have natural infiltration, natural filtration through the sand and other matters from the aquifer. So it's not surface water, and we're very happy. We do have a lake and a creek. However, the village down the valley from us does have to chlorinate because they take from surface water. So how can we ensure that that's going to be around in the long term? But once you start looking into natural asset management, you realize everything we do, as been stated by other presenters, there's not anything that our natural assets don't touch. So with our recreation, we have a campground that is both on the lake and on the creek. We have an outdoor exercise equipment that's part of our recreational trail, that part of what we sort of value here is our natural environment of the trees and the creeks, as well as the fact that we have emergency management preparations. So in terms of flooding, what do we have to look when we're managing that kind of, and we work with the regional districts. So emergency management, what are we looking at? Is there going to be more flood events? When are they going to happen? The most interesting thing to me is our most recent scare of a flood was actually in the winter months, because the ice that builds up on the rocks and boulders inside the creek, all of a sudden there started to become an ice jam, and it almost created a flood in the community, which was unusual to that point. It had always been a freshet event. So how do we manage for that, and what would it have looked like if we were having to do our flood mitigation in the winter rather than in the summer? Very, very different amounts of snow that we have here, as well as there's been more talk for emergency management, and I don't know how many people have heard of this, but of having safe spots or safe public areas for extreme cold or extreme warm, and it's more to do with the heat that happens, to ensure that people have a cool place to go. not only to look at how much the cost of those extreme events are having on terms of how much energy we're using, as Mel had stated, but also how do we keep our citizens safe when they are at risk due to these extreme events. So that is why I'm so interested in natural asset management. So how do you integrate it? Well, luckily we had started the asset management process already, and so we mapped out our traditional assets of roads, water, we don't have sewer, and community buildings. And so then we had council ask about, well, what about tree inventory, and what about urban forests that other communities are talking about, and how do we deal with that? And we recently had 2 trees fall down on a community member's house, which made us take 100 trees out of our municipal campground. So if we had had a tree inventory process, would we have been able to mitigate having to take down 100 trees all at once and the definitely changed landscape after that? So that's the project I'm working on right now, that we are using a lens of how are we looking at this from a long term, and how do we keep this natural asset as natural as possible, and what is it that it brings to our community in terms of the lake flooding, because it is on the lake, or the creek flooding, and how can we now rebuild that will help mitigate any types of emergencies or types of events that may happen due to climate change. So, that's my timer, and so I obviously could keep talking for much longer, but in terms of
a minute, you can keep going. You can keep going for a minute. You're stopping yourself early. You've still got some time.
Okay, good. So it was our GIS software that really made us want to try and integrate it as easily as possible to be able to communicate to the public and council, and to have that sort of low carbon lens and climate change lens of in everything we do. So with a small staff, luckily it's easy for us to be able to communicate that. And because I am part of most of our projects that we do, I can ask myself, so are there any climate mitigation solutions that we can do for this particular project? Is there a way that we can lower our carbon footprint or lower our emissions with something that we are doing with this project? And so you just keep always asking yourself these questions, whatever ones that you've decided are appropriate for a community, and you just keep asking them, and that's how I use that lens of how do we make our decisions better and really utilize our natural assets as an asset, not just a building that costs $1 million, but what if I had to rebuild for the community some potable water that wasn't the aquifer? We didn't have to dig a well. We dug 2 wells, but we don't have to have the infrastructure of a holding tank and a whole filtration system that the municipality down the road has to do. So how do we then plan for the future to ensure the aquifer is there, and or replace it with something, an alternative, and what would we need to do? So those are some of the questions that we've started to look into and try to answer as we move forward with all of our projects in the village of Silverton.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hillary.
Sorry,
yeah, these were you were speaking to these, but you didn't change the slides.
No.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you covered it very well. So thanks very much for that. And I do think it's an interesting comment on, we do talk about smaller municipalities, smaller communities having less capacity, but sometimes there's a greater capacity for the integration and this systemic thinking. So it's very interesting to hear how there is that effectiveness. So wonderful. So now what we're going to do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is we're going to invite you to join a breakout room. It's your choose your own adventure. So you're going to go and pick Mel, Ian, Dustin, or Manny and Hillary will be in the same room talking from the local government perspective. And we're going to have everybody just choose your own adventure, go into your breakout room. I think Mel is going to actually show a little bit of how his tool, the data tool, works. So you have an opportunity to see that if you go into his room. And so if you just go down to the bottom of the screen here, you'll see the breakout rooms icon. And then you just, so now when I'm,
Deb, I just have to open the rooms first.
pardon?
I just have to open the room. So once you're done.
Sorry, that's right. So this is just mentioned. We'd like to ask one of you in the audience to volunteer to share a 1 minute, just a 1 minute comment on this session, the highlights of this session and what you saw today. Can we ask for a volunteer? Just put your name in the chat. And or we'll have to pick on someone. So there's a brave soul. Come on, somebody. We need a volunteer.
Now Ingrid says no pressure, but.
Shall I just pick someone?
You might have to.
Okay. Gail Morton, would you be willing to do a 1 minute report back?
I prefer not to. I don't feel qualified. But thank you for asking.
I'm going down the list. How about Jerry Leering?
Yeah, I can try.
You would be willing to try?
As far as the afternoon session, it was very informative. I also like to comment on the whole format, that I'm super impressed with the way this is working out quite well. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's session as well.
Well, now, Jerry, so Ingrid, can you put your mic on and just explain when this 1 minute recap would be required?
Absolutely. So we're going to break out into open space from 3:15 to 3:45 Pacific. And then right after the open space, we're going to come back for a short closing at 3:45. And yeah, that link is in your sessions on the event platform, and we'll be wrapped up by 4. So very quick. Just want to bring everybody together and close the day in a good way.
That's great. So, and I think this is, Jerry, this is where Ingrid's hoping that you might be willing to do your 1 minute, just a quick few comments about what happened in our session today. Is that okay with you?
I don't know whether I'll last a minute.
Okay, it'll just be really nice to get some other voices in the closing from participants, and we're just asking for one person from each session. I don't know, I'm going back to what was spoken about in the keynote this morning about, being a little uncomfortable. And that's, it's not a bad place when we're trying to bridge some silos.
Alrighty, look forward to it.
Awesome.
Very rock.
Thank you
so much. We really appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody. And thanks to our wonderful panelists. We very much look forward to working with you tomorrow. And do go back to the event platform. It's so impressive what RDI has done with FeedLoop and all these new tools that we're starting to get to use. Thank goodness for computers during COVID. So keeping us connected as much as we can be. So thanks again. And we look forward to working with everyone tomorrow. Thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to Jerry for being a sport about doing our 1 minute update. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.